Okay, so this is a few notes about mitosis, and we're going to talk about cyclins in the cell cycle, then we'll talk about the stages of mitosis, and we'll talk about cancer and the mitotic index. So first off are cyclins. Now cyclins control their proteins that control the progression of the cell cycle. So what they do is they bind with what we call cyclin-dependent kinases. Right, so you can see those right here. You can see the cyclins. So they bind together, and then when they bind together, CDK becomes activated. Oops. Okay, so it then becomes activated, and you can see what happens in the next step here is it hits some target protein. Now this target protein is going to be involved in the cell cycle. Okay, and you can see here it transfers a phosphate group. So it undergoes it phosphorylates that target protein right here. Okay, that causes this protein. Could be an enzyme, it could be a signaling protein. There's lots of different options there, but it triggers some event in the cell cycle. Okay, so once that happens, that event's triggered. There's some kind of feedback loop which destroys that cyclin, and then that stops the cell cycle from going. But that generally happens afterwards. Okay. So looking at this, so you guys have talked about the cell cycle at some point. Um, you can see that most of the cell cycle is interphase here. Okay. That's the longest part of the cell cycle. Mitosis is actually a very small part of the cell cycle. Now, highlighted here in purple are three what we call checkpoints. Okay, so these are areas where there's a slight pause in the process, and that pause is there to check to make sure that everything is okay. Okay, and really these pauses help prevent cancer. Is the main reason is that cells that can become cancerous somehow circumvent these checkpoints and are allowed to continue to divide, and then they lose all those checkpoints. So if you look here, there's a couple of them. So there's the G1 to S phase. And if you remember, G1 phase is really about you're prepping for DNA replication, centrosomes are replicated, and you get some growth. And then you get to S phase, and that's the synthesis of DNA, hence the S phase. And basically this is where DNA replication is occurring. So your DNA is copied. Okay? And then you get to G2 phase, which is further growth and preparation for the actual division of the cells. Okay, and the division of that DNA. Okay? So the first checkpoint here is the G1 to S phase. And if you notice here, cyclin E peaks at that stage. And there's other cyclins that are involved in this, but just giving you kind of an example. So notice the concentration gets high enough, and it's that idea, that's what triggers the movement to the next stage, okay? So you can think of cyclin E as the checkpoint. Then if you look at the next stage, which is going from G2 to M, and you can see here that, that cyclin A is involved in that. Notice it peaks right at the point when it moves into mitosis. And then notice it decreases, right? And same with cyclin E, right? So we've reached this point here, okay? And then the very last checkpoint is in the middle of mitosis. It's from metaphase to anaphase. Now, if you remember, metaphase to anaphase is when those chromosomes actually pull apart. Okay, so if the conditions aren't reached there, and it pulls apart anyway, you could have some major issues with that. So that's another checkpoint here, and notice that's mainly controlled by an enzyme called cyclin B. And there's some other ones here, but those cyclins are the ones that control that. So the whole point with these cyclins is they're needed in most cases, to move through these various checkpoints. Okay, so once those are complete, that cell cycle can move through each of those checkpoints and can replicate. And knowing that it's going to replicate correctly and safely, decreasing the risk of having any type of cancer. Okay, so I hope that helps with cyclins. Next, we'll